morning. Although I do know quite a bit about the Yorkshire weather, because I can actually thank Councillor Andrew Cooper from Kirklees for teaching me all about it very closely firsthand, because last January he had me up on the moors planting apple trees in the snow in January. And I'm told that people said, gosh, that Green Party leader, she's quite good at getting her hands dirty and digging holes. It was either that or freeze. That was the two options available. And I must admit, in this part of the world, I do feel quite at home, because as Rosie said, my first degree was agricultural science. I worked quite a bit on Australian farms and put that Australia and the ag science together. And I do believe, as well as being the only science graduate as party leader, I believe I'm probably the only British party political leader who knows how to shear a sheep. which means I feel quite at home around here. But to be serious, we are at an amazing, exciting, frightening point in British politics and British society. And the state of this room, I think, this evening demonstrates it very well. And apologies to everyone up the back who's having to stand. But the fact is, we're actually facing 4 crises in Britain at the moment. We've got a continuing economic crisis. And just this morning we had the Bank of International Settlements, big international organisation of bankers, saying there's a huge amount of risk into the system. A few months ago they said we're closer to a financial crash now than we were in 2007. We've got a social crisis of inequality, of the fact that the economy isn't meeting people's basic needs. The classic figure, 1 million people last year depended on food banks to feed themselves. Here, in the world's 6th richest country, 1 million people had to rely on charity to be able to put food on the table. And one of the things that really terrifies me and horrifies me about that is that I know lots of people who are donating to those food banks. A great many of them aren't very far off needing the food bank themselves. And where that balance changes over, you've really got to start to worry about the state of things. And then, of course, we've got the environmental crisis. And the astonishing thing, really, when you think about it, is the fact that we have in Britain, although we've got so many people going hungry, we've got 20% of workers on less than a living wage, not being paid enough money to live on. Yet all of us collectively, no matter how we live as individuals, we're all collectively using the resources of 3 planets every year. And yet we've only got 1 planet. It really does sometimes seem that our leaders, the people running things, think that we can just really trash this one, and there's a second spare one, pristine, sitting on the other side of the moon, ready for us to hop over. But of course there isn't. And that environmental crisis, we rightly talk a lot about climate change, but there's so much more. The fact that we're turning our oceans into a plastic soup, the fact that we're destroying our soils at an enormous rate. And as an ag scientist, I can get very geeky about soils, but I'm going to be kind to you and not get geeky about soils tonight. And there was the figure that came out a couple of weeks ago, really absolutely telling about our wildlife. In the past 40 years, we've lost 50%, we've lost half of the animals in the world. The animal population is half what it was 40 years ago. And that really is a measure of the state of our world. And then finally, there's the political crisis that's been so very clear. In Britain, we've got 3 business as usual parties who are running the same kind of neoliberal Thatcherite agenda that's dominated our politics for the past 35 years or so. And then we've got a party that's running the same agenda but more so, more extreme, but that waves lots of pints of beer around. And, I was actually at Doncaster at the Stand Up to UKIP demonstration a couple of weeks ago around the UKIP conference. And one of the things that we were singing in the streets that really struck me as having real truth in it was that Nigel Farage is Maggie Thatcher in disguise. And that, is really where we are. So it's really not surprising that people feel like politics has really failed. And yet that's the crisis, but we've also got the opportunity that's very clear in politics, the opportunity that's been displayed with the Scottish referendum. Now, whatever you actually think, whatever your thought was about yes or no, and the fact that that I'm the leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, and our Scots went independent in 1990, will give you a clue about where I stand on that. But the fact is that people got involved in politics. People really believed that their vote could make a difference. I was up there out canvassing for a couple of hours a week or so before the referendum. And in 2 hours on the streets, I met one non-voter. And that was in a pretty poor bit of Edinburgh. If I went round to the pretty poor bits of most English cities, and I found one voter in 2 hours, I think I was doing quite well. And so we've actually got huge disillusionment with politics, but also a rising sense of hope, a rising sense that things can change. And that's really why the fact that although it's easy to look in a glass half empty kind of way and say that, oh, we've got all these crises and we're happening all at once and they're all happening all at once and how are we going to deal with it? The other way of looking at this is saying it's very clear that everything has to change. We have to change the way our whole society works because we've got all these crises at once. And if we only had one of them, you might just tinker with things. But it's clear that we need real change to a society that works for the common good, that works for everybody. And that's what I believe what the Green Party wants to offer. And I think if we think about what does that actually mean, I've got two quite simple criteria to apply. And that is, and let's start with Britain because it's enough to be going on with, but ultimately I'm talking about the whole world. Let's say that we need everyone to have access to the resources for a decent quality of life. Quite simply, everyone should feel confident, secure, safe, that they'll be able to have food on the table, a roof over their head, meet the basic needs that every human being has. And we have to all do that collectively within the limits of our one planet, because one planet is all we have. And so those are the kind of two criteria that in the Green Party where we start from. And we say that we need to change our economy, we need to change our society, we definitely need to change the way we treat the environment, and we need to change our politics. And just briefly in terms of the politics, one of the things that I think we haven't thought about very much, but it's time we did, is the fact that Westminster, nothing has really fundamentally changed in the Westminster Parliament in 100 years. The last really significant change in Westminster was women getting the vote. That was a while ago. And the fact is that what we're calling for is a People's Constitutional Convention. We've got lots of ideas about what we should do. We think there should definitely be elected House of Lords. There should be proportional representation in the Commons. We think there should be much more power returned to local and regional areas. Local councils shouldn't just be forced to act like an arm of national government. But rather than us saying and delivering from top down what it should be, we say, let's have a People's Constitutional Convention. Let's start from scratch. We can't just tinker with this. We need to start again and create a constitution to solve our political crisis. So that's the political crisis. In terms of the economic crisis, well, what we have now is a situation where rich individuals, and particularly multinational companies, aren't paying their way. They're not paying their workers a fair wage. They're not paying their fair share of taxes. And that's why we call for a £10 an hour minimum wage by 2020. And some of you might know that Labor came out and said £8 an hour by 2020. And I do stress that this isn't a bidding war. We said it first. But actually, we didn't just pull that figure out of the air. That figure is based on the principle that we say the minimum wage should be a living wage now. If you work full time, you should earn enough money to live on. It's really not that radical a statement, actually. And then we're saying, let's assume an inflation rate of 3% a year, and we round it up a little to get to a nice round number because sort of 9.78 sounds it's a bit hard to say really. £10 an hour by 2020, a basic, decent living wage for everybody. Now, I think one of the things that people very often ask me about is that what about small business? And the fact is, at the moment, small business is doing things really tough. And one of the big reasons why small business is doing things really tough is that big business is trampling all over them and all over the rest of us. And that means the big multinational companies that are not only got their workers on minimum wage, but also got 0 hours contracts, are forcing people to work part-time when they'd really like to work full-time. They're simply not treating their workers fairly. And of course they're not paying their taxes. Now I'll guarantee that most people in this room will either have bought or have had bought for them in the last year something from the website known as Amazon. It's hard to avoid it. And yet, you know, last year, and there are enormous sales in Britain, last year they paid 0.01% of their turnover in tax. They effectively paid no tax at all in Britain on huge sales. And those sales have taken out, the obvious thing that went first was bookshops. Some of you will remember, maybe you're lucky enough to still have the odd occasional local bookshop, but most of them, the independents, have gone. Shoe shops are going, independent clothes shops are going, and they're struggling to compete with the big guys who don't pay their staff properly and don't pay their taxes. And you know, there's not many local greengrocers who've got 10 subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands. Maybe one or two, but there's not many. And so what we're saying, we need to rebalance our economy back around local small businesses, cooperatives, strong local economies in which the money goes round and round, rather than big multinational companies where the money swishes off way out of Yorkshire off to head office and all too often into the nearest tax haven. And a couple of other things that small business desperately needs is small business desperately needs to see big business obeying the law. One of the things that I saw, you've probably seen these, you know, these mini supermarkets popping up everywhere, the Tesco's, Sainsbury's and all the rest of it. And most of them have no storeroom. They rely on just-in-time deliveries from HGVs. And most of them have seen what they've done to our high streets. The HGVs parked outside the shop for a couple of hours, blocks the street, traffic chaos, lots of pollution. And if they get a parking fine, they get a parking fine. It's just part of the cost of doing business. And no one should be allowed to operate their business on the basis they're going to be breaking the law on a regular basis. And one of the other things, of course, about big business is that often they pay their small suppliers unfairly, they squeeze them hard. And when I was a teenager, I used to work for a small business who supplied big supermarkets. And he had what most of the big supermarkets do, which is 90-day terms, which means paying the bills after 3 months. Except 90 days usually turns into 120 in practice, because you know they lose the account or they don't get round to it or something. And small businesses really struggle to survive. So we need to actually rebalance this economy so that we've got small business has the chance to compete, has a fair go, that they treat their workers properly and have a different kind of economy. And you think about it, imagine that small greengrocer, maybe if you're lucky enough you've still got that local small greengrocer. When she wants a new sign, she'll employ a local sign writer. When she wants some new shelves, she'll employ a local carpenter. She's got an accountant to do her books. She might have some legal things, she'll employ a local solicitor. All of those things that are the bedrock of a local economy with a variety of jobs, a variety of business opportunities. Ideally, perhaps in an ideal world, some of those apple trees that I was planting in the snow before, she could be actually buying her apples from a local auction. So what we need to do is really change our economy around, rebalance it away from the big multinationals, back towards small businesses, cooperatives, local businesses. And that's the kind of direction that we need to go in. And then I was talking about rich individuals. And one of the things that's very clearly been happening is rich people, particularly the top 1%, have been getting richer and richer, while the rest of us get poorer. And that's why the Green Party is calling for a wealth tax for people who are worth more than £3 million, that they should pay a levy, a tax of 1 or 2% a year. And the kind of money that would raise, it raises between about a quarter and a half of the cost of the NHS. So it's not entirely transformatory, but it's not insignificant either. And one of the really important things to say about this is we're not talking about this as a punitive kind of tax. It's not a punishment for being rich. The rich are actually people too. They actually need the kind of services that we all need. They need the roads, they need the policing. If they get really ill, they need the NHS. All of those services they need to make a fair contribution towards, because the kind of austerity that this government's been applying that's cutting away at those essential services, we cannot continue that. We need those services. Those services are essential to all of our lives. And is they're getting those services and the rest of us are getting those services too. So we need to move in a different kind of direction in terms of the economy, in terms of supporting our public services. And just incidentally, while I'm on the NHS, we need to say very loudly and clearly that the profit motive has no place in healthcare. We need to say that the NHS should be publicly owned and publicly run. And there's a huge sneaking privatisation going on at the moment. And just to give you one example of this, there was a contract let in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough for care of older people, is the terminology, and that included end-of-life care. And there are now a big multinational health company making profits out of end-of-life care. And I think when you think about that, that really illustrates the obscenity of handing our health service over to private business, as well as the fact that what we're actually handing it over to are mostly American companies that come out of the American healthcare system, which costs them twice the percentage of GDP that our health system does, and has far worse health outcomes. We're not importing any kind of efficiency, any kind of skills, any kind of knowledge. What we're importing is an utterly failed American health system into our health system that is actually, and still is, very good. And so that's the kind of model, and one of the other things that we need to change is that whole model of privatisation. Many of you may know that the Green Party is the only party calling for the railways to be brought back into public hands. We're saying that let's run the railways for the passengers, not for shareholders. And Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, now has a private member's bill before Parliament calling for just that. And that's the right way to run the railways, both philosophically, ideologically, but also practically. There was a very good report out about a couple of years back called Rethinking Rail, and the fragmentation of our current rail system is actually costing us more than £1 billion a year. Just the way we have all the different companies that all have to coordinate with each other, and when something goes wrong, someone's got to work out whose train goes first, and all those kind of things. It costs us £1 billion a year. And that's the equivalent of 16% off rail fares. So, given we've got the most expensive rail fares in Western Europe, wouldn't make us them the cheapest, but would certainly help us all a little bit. So then I come on to thinking about tackling the environmental crisis. And one of the first things to say is fracking is no answer at all, quite simply. It's interesting, I did a survey with a whole lot of people from the energy industry, and some of them were pro-fracking and some of them were anti. But actually, they were asked to vote in a straw poll, do you think fracking could be a significant source of energy for Britain? And it was 100% no. The government is actually pursuing this fantasy of fracking, and that's a really important distraction from what we need to be doing, which is, first of all, the first thing we have to talk about is energy conservation, because the best, greenest, cheapest energy you can possibly have is the energy you don't have to use. And we have some of the leakiest homes, the worst insulated homes in Western Europe. We have a huge fuel poverty problem, and a large part of that fuel poverty problem comes from the fact that we have a really poor quality of housing stock. Now, one of the things the Green Party backs is what's called the Energy Bill Revolution, which was developed by the NGOs and charities like Help the Aged. And they say, let the government take the money it gets in carbon taxes and put energy efficiency measures into every home that needs it. And you can do that over a couple of decades. You can lift 9 out of 10 households out of fuel poverty. You create